Innate helps companies avoid project surprises, make better informed decisions, share knowledge, and deliver better outcomes. Innate, transforming the way the world builds.
Hello, project people. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Project Chatter podcast. It's always great to have you with us. And for this special episode, I'm not joined by Dale because he decided to go camping. But instead, I have a much more smiley co-host, veteran of the podcast, Jo Lucas. Hey, Jo, how are you?
Hey, Val. Good to be here.
It's so good to have you with us because I don't think I could be doing this on my own. I need the energy, I need the passion, I need you here, Jo. So thanks for taking time out of your day, especially in the morning, and joining me today for our special guest, Kate McAlpine. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
And thank you for taking some time out because, again, I know you have a busy schedule and we have so much to cover in this podcast. And I was saying to you, Jo, before we press record, how are we going to get this all done in an hour? Or we might have to make a part 2, a part 3, and so on and so forth. So I'm looking forward to that. But look, most guests, especially the new guests on our show, we usually ask them, where did you come from? How did you get here? A bit about the origin story, because it's fascinating how people arrive into their roles or their professions, particularly in projects and the work that you do. We would love to hear about where it all got started for you, Kate.
Gosh, thank you. Yeah, my origin story is probably atypical. I born and brought up in a family of builders who weren't particularly encouraging of women to go into the industry, and whether born or nurtured as a very stubborn, self-directed young lady, I completely pivoted and studied history at Oxford. Met my now husband, who was an ecologist, is an ecologist. And we said post-university, we're off to Tanzania. And initially we were off to Tanzania for a year to see what happened. And 27 years later, still there, made a life and a career. And I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew that I didn't want to be in the UK and I didn't want to have a conventional career. And I ended up working with street children and completely sort of serendipitously, back in the early 90s, we were in a town called Moshi, which is at the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro. And every day when you went into town, kids would beg. And, everybody would always say, you mustn't give them money, you mustn't give them money. And I was like, well, what do you do then? And so I started a soup kitchen. And we got a local printer to print vouchers, and we sold those in the local shops, and people could buy those instead of giving kids money, hand out the voucher. And Joe, my husband, had a tree nursery. So we stuck up some tables and got ourselves a little Chico, which is, a little sort of coffee husk fired cooker, and some sufuria, which are the big metal dishes that you cook ugali and so on in. And we started to soup kitchen. And it just grew. It just grew. Then the kids said, well, we want education. So we started to provide non-formal education. Then they wanted to educate the community about their situation. So we started a community engagement program. And 10 years later, we were selected as the best child protection program in East Africa. So it just grew, and it was extraordinary. I have no social welfare training, no psychology training, no nothing. And actually, when I started to have my own children, I found the frontline work very traumatizing. We would be going to court with children who had been raped. And back then, the children would be in a court defending themselves face to face with the rapist. And I just found the dissonance of then going home to a 2-year-old who'd scraped her knee and giving the same care and attention, too much to handle. So I was introduced to a program at Fielding University on organizational development and management, and chose to do my master's, and really then pivoted my career around how to build healthy organizations in the civil society space. So kept work with the street kids, but moved much more into organizational health and strategy, and then did a coaching qualification. So then moved into leadership development for young civic leaders in East Africa. So a lot of my work was strategy and so on. And then I thought, oh, I've got 2 master's degrees. Why not do a PhD? So did a PhD actually focusing on organizational systems and human development. And at that point, I had shifted away from the street kids more into legal advocacy. So was very involved in the campaign for what's known as the Children's Act. And that was a ground-piece of legislation in Tanzania that finally put children's rights into law and was absolutely a precondition for change to happen. So moved into legal advocacy and campaigning then to enact the law. And so we started a national campaign using theatre for development. And so we had a theatre troupe that would go out on the intercity buses and would sort of almost mock up a sort of fake situation where, you know, we're a couple on the bus and we're on the phone and we can hear something's gone on at home and there's a problem at home and they're talking very loudly. And they'd use it as a spur then for dialogue on all these passengers around how to respond to situations of violence against children. And it was fantastic. People are stuck on these buses for 6-7 hours. So it was not what they signed up for when they bought their ticket. But what it did then was mean that we could drive thousands of people to our radio and TV shows. And I had a sample of people who had already self-identified as child protectors. So it was with those samples that I then used to interview for my research. And what I was really trying to understand was what is going on when people try to do the right thing in uncertain situations. And the PhD eventually developed a theory that I called doing the right thing. And it is really hypothesizing around how do people behave pro-socially when the norms of the past are under sort of tension, and yet new norms of behavior have yet to emerge. So in that liminal space. So after that, set up another social enterprise, obviously a little bit of an addiction to social enterprises and starting things up, called Citizens for Change. And that's what I currently run alongside my business. And it's really catalyzing a social movement. You know, 27 years in Tanzania, I have seen thousands and thousands of people try and do the right thing. And yet the narrative coming out of Africa all the time is this sort of narrative of problems and victims. And so what we have done is develop a sort of mobile digital technology to crowdsource data from people who do the right thing by children and women, and to learn from their wisdom. So we survey them using SMS, face-to-face, mobiles, a lot of participatory action research. And then data analytics, really to learn from their wisdom. And what we're trying to prove is that there is a groundswell of pro-social, citizen-driven behavior that development agencies and governments need to learn from. There is wisdom in the crowd. So we're doing that. We have at the moment 26,000 people in the movement. And funnily enough, the tech, and this is what myself and Jo always sort of talk about, is I really think it's potentially groundbreaking. So we've spun out the tech into a social enterprise called Connect Go. And really we are offering it to social purpose organizations, so charities, social movements, not-for-profits, funders in the ESG space, as a way for them to be able to tell the story and make meaning of the change that they're achieving in the world. So people can use the tech to, for example, map social networks. So at the moment, we've mapped the most connected people in rural communities that citizens go to for help. And then we work with them, particularly as change makers, to sort of diffuse social change through their communities. We use the tech to mobilize at scale and sort of conduct social listening about barriers to progress. So we're working with an Anglican church community to understand really what are their barriers to prosperity and therefore what changes. And so, you know, there's a gazillion applications of this. We combine a social return on investment element, so you can actually sort of put a broad monetary proxy on impact being achieved. And so that's the origin story, long, convoluted, sort of weird to end up in the UK talking about projects.
Oh, that was fantastic. I think Jo and I really appreciate how that's kind of come about. And the swell, as you said, I think it touches all of us, that where it started and how it's grown and how you leveraging technology to impact or enhance and amplify that change. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, and I think that's the key word, is that amplification. I mean, that's really the word that we use now, whether it's Citizens for Change working with partners on the ground and amplifying the impact that they see anecdotally, or whether it's with clients and using the tech to sort of evidence change, because the work is going on. The work is going on in all sorts of settings and communities and citizen groupings. It's just that the system, if you will, in inverted commas, is sort of viscerally blind to that work. So I think a lot of our work is revelation more than anything else.
Yeah, I happen to agree. It's great to hear your story as well, because you know, you encompassed around the why and how it affected you, and then for your career, or at least your purpose, which I think you found it, you figured out the how. And I think a lot of people in the world understand the why. Like, why would we want to support and protect women and children and people who are less fortunate and impoverished people? But they don't know the how. They see like it's overwhelming, perhaps, the concept of change. But you're actually flipping it on the head a little bit. You're saying, you know, cliche it is, but one person can make that change. And it was a great storyline there. And I think more people that hear this, the better, and it might even be inspiring for them. And I certainly want to be, I mean, I just want to sign up to Citizen for Change. I don't even know what it is yet, but I certainly want to be a part of whatever this is. I know Jo as well. Jo and I are actually talking on other concepts around ESG as well, and the carbon footprint. So we're going to talk about that in a second. My other question was, I guess, from a behavioral perspective, because you've done quite a few academic studies, and your PhD, particularly in communities. How do you, even with these champions of people doing the right thing, how do you then kind of cascade that down or impact positively the community around them?
So I think that one of the key constructs that has emerged from my research is this idea of ujasiri. And in Swahili, ujasiri means confidence or bravery, but it also has a number of dimensions. So it's founded in empathy. And the empathy itself starts in childhood. But when we talk to citizen protectors, they say they're never neutral about their childhood. They say, I either had a childhood of love that taught me how to manifest compassion for others, or I had a childhood of pain, which I actively wanted to counter. But the result is a very strong empathetic resonance. So one of the key variables that we're always looking at, and it's one of the assumptions that we're always testing, is, can you build empathy in adults if it hasn't been fostered? Because empathy is normally fostered before the age of 5. So that's one of the things. The second element about ujasiri is really about people's moral development. The core construct is that I have to be a responsible citizen. And for many in the context of Tanzania, that comes from a space of faith. But for others, it also, for young people, it comes from what it means to be a young person in society. I have to demonstrate that I'm a responsible citizen. And then the final element is really, it's a sort of a sense of hope that if I help someone, they will pay forward the help that I've given them. So there's these dimensions in ujasiri that are really key to identifying who are those key connectors. Then you combine it with an urgency for change. So one of the things that we use the tech for is to survey who has an urgency for change, because without that, there's nothing. And then we get to the how, the toolbox. So we say, okay, you're sort of viscerally motivated. You feel the sense of now. but we all do things. It's sort of the paradox of the Good Samaritan. I may want to help, but then I realize I don't really have the knowledge and skills, and particularly because we work in the realm of violence, to know what to do that is in a child's best interest. So that's where we also use a lot of the tech and the SMS messaging to deliver educational info in 140 characters about child development, so that people are actually building their toolbox. And what we're actually doing at the moment is working with Tanzania's junior councils, which are like the youth parliaments, to take them through a process of becoming citizens for change and facilitating this with their peers, because it is the how, like you say, that there's room to, build the toolbox. You just Siri pretty much set, there's not much we can do to influence that. But identifying those individuals and then nurturing their toolbox, I think, is an opportunity then for scaling.
That is amazing. And I think for Jo and I, before we even had you on the call, we were talking about how that we can transition and transpose some of these great learnings from yourself and the application of it in the social form into projects, because we are seeing many of the same, because you have these communities that are challenged. We have impoverished people. We have people who want to do the right thing, I think, and are, I guess, constrained rather than not having resources. They're constrained to have access, to speak up, to have the courage. And I love that you've gone back to that child and that question, and I'll just rephrase it. Can you build empathy in adults? I mean, just going on that again, is that something you think is possible, and how or where have you seen that?
I think that it's a hard space, because of course we're all in progressive land socialized to think empathy is such a great thing. What I tend to see is a lot of sympathy in adults, and this is again, I think, one of those flex points, is that you, in like you say, in the corporate space, there's a lot of stuff that's focused around charity and CSR, which is slightly different in ethos than being a change maker and being an active citizen. And I think that what happens is that you see a lot of sympathy, but empathy does lead you to action. And I'm not seeing, like you say, where maybe the space is a bit limited in corporate settings for that civic action bit. There's a lot of cultivation of the charitable bit. There's so many employee programs that people are going out and doing fundamental stuff, but it's not that civic transformation, which is the bit that I'm always interested in.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's brilliant. I've spoken to you so many times and I actually haven't heard your full backstory. Just brilliant to hear that as well. I mean, really impressive, and explains why you can speak the way you do. What I'm really interested in is that this civic action idea is actually fundamental to me, and how do you grab some of that, harness some of that energy that's happening in these sort of invisible, unseen, unheard, unnoticed ways, and how do you bubble that up to the surface? And I think there's a huge amount actually, and I think we've got this idea that we need to go help communities outside of the project community, but I think actually there's a lot of work that can be done internally within the project community such that you build in a better way. And I was just wondering, like, how do you see the sort of technology you're using being able to translate into that kind of space of all these? There's a very strong youth voice going on at the moment where they are in this, I think you put it really beautifully, where you're saying that, the norms of the past have gone, but we haven't quite worked out what the norms of now is. So sort of speaking to not just the young, because there's plenty of us who are trying to do this across the spectrum of the projects, of how do you help that transition? How do you connect into that energy in a way that really does transform it into action?
Yeah, and I think that's the key question, isn't it? Connecting into the energy. I mean, I'm particularly intrigued at the potential of social network analyses, and really understand, essentially a social network analysis. How you go about it is you have a question of interest. So, who do you go to for help? Maybe you're looking for help in relationships, or who do you go to if you want to understand what to do in a certain setting. But it's a name generation exercise. So it's not, oh, I go to my manager, or I go to my, my direct report, or it's, I go to, Anne or Joe or Mark. And in generating that names, you ask that of everybody across the space. And then the most centrally connected people are your key individuals. And it's in them that even if they don't know the energy resides in them, others are seeing the energy reside in them. So I just really feel that they are your key points of opportunity in the space. And like you say, very rarely in a business, there will be a whole set of perceptions about who to go to, tied to organizational structures and hierarchies and positional power. And then there's this subterranean world that has its own life, and the system doesn't see it. And I think it's getting into, I mean, you like your what's it called? Remind me
mycelium.
Mycelium. It's early and I've only had one coffee. But it's really about how do you map that mycelium and tap into it, because the energy's there. I just think that the system is blind to it.
So I can see, because this is very relationship based as an approach. So you're really looking at how do people interact with each other, which then kind of, in the projects world, you have a very strong sense of, this is how you work. And it's a very what-based thing. It's sort of, we use Prince, we use Agile, we use Lean, we use whatever the latest thing is. Yeah. But if you find out that the key relationships are sitting with people who don't really match that kind of formal system, how does that transition work? Like, how do you deal with the sort of the fighting the system? I presume there's an issue around the way the government funds things and things like that. Like, do you fight the system, or do you work within the constraints of what's already there? Do you just push at the edges? Is it a big shift? Is it a small shift? What's worked best to kind of create that sort of, yes, there's a system, we can't just start from scratch. Do we play within the boundaries, or do we push them?
That's a really good question. Of course, we talk about system a lot in the context of the work I do in Tanzania, and I'm doing a 2-year action research project in a very rural community to address violence against women and children. And the client is a feminist trust fund. So they're fascinated by the system, and they've structured their work around saying, we will influence the formal system, because the formal system has its national plan of action to address violence, and therefore we've got to influence it. But when we've done this mapping, what's actually emerged is there's no such thing as a formal and an informal system, because individuals inhabit both. And so that's why I like to talk about the idea of a toolbox. It's not so much the formal system, it's what tools do we need as humans to navigate certain spaces. So it may be, like you say, that in certain procedural efforts, there's a set of processes or tools that just have to be adhered to. But the starting point is still individuals and their relationships with each other. So I always see the sort of the formal stuff as more an artifact rather than as a driver.
Oh,
I don't think you can drive stuff by getting people excited by Agile.
What are you saying?
Let me get up in the morning and, go to work with my Agile system.
They are out there. There are some.
Yeah, I remember when I was doing my master's in organizational development, people got very excited about this stuff, Six Sigma. But I think at the end of the day, they're artifacts, aren't they? They're like the hammers and the spanners and the JCBs. They're just tools to get stuff done.
Oh, I like that image. I was thinking about them as like historical artifacts as well. It's like, that's how it used to run. It's like, let's put it in a nice museum and move on.
Yeah.
I want to sort of move us to the ESG space, actually, just sort of shift across, because I'm reading a lot at the moment about ESG and trying to get my head around how does it get measured? What does it mean? What does it look like? What is this? What are we trying to do with this? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it, of course, somewhere vaguely in between? And one of the things I love about the sort of work you're doing is that you're effectively measuring relationships, which are the core. You're not measuring how good the relationships are, etc. But you're acknowledging the fact that organizations are made up of a whole series of relationships, and it's really important to look at that. How do you see a link between that sort of approach, a very relationship-based approach of putting data against that, linked to something like ESG, which still feels very it's
very interesting. Like you say, there's a lot of attention on ESG, and I'm also a little unclear where ESG investment starts and finishes, and philanthropy starts and finishes, and bilateral, multilateral aids. So let's just say people who finance stuff that's supposed to do good, as the umbrella. How do you measure that? Well, if it's supposed to do good, the precondition for that is to be able to make sense of complexity. Because, and I think therein lies the great rub of this whole ESG fad at the moment, is a lot of these ESG impact trackers sort of almost assume that you can track activity and reach, and you've got your impact tracker, as if the impact just magically occurs. But if you've worked in the development space, you know that change is inherently complex, and therefore you need to work in an emergent way, adaptively, deep social listening. So a lot of how I am trying to position Connect Go is, it's not about an impact tracker with a nice little dashboard and nice metrics. It's about being able to tell the story of change in complex settings. And so, yes, that may start with mapping those relationships and being able to show how they change over time. It may look like people sharing their stories and being able to do a sort of grounded theory analysis of the wisdom inherent in those stories and theorizing about change. It may then be doing a listening exercise to see, were those anticipated outcomes actually achieved, or was there a whole bunch of unintended? But again, they're tools to tell a story of change. They're not a final product that says ESG outcomes achieved, tick. I think this is the great tension, is people resist complexity, but if you're in the world of social change or environmental change, it's complex because it starts with human relationships, and human relationships are complex. So again, it's almost like an epistemological or ontological understanding of the world. And I always start with that. Subjectivity is key. Why do we dismiss subjectivity as a key, valid form of knowledge? Everything starts with subjectivity. So why don't we tap into it? And, so like you say, that's some of the tensions that then play out in that ESG measuring change land.
It's great. These are all great points. I just realized in this call how dumb I really am. But it's great to be surrounded by people who are so inspiring and so interesting. And some of the things you said really do hit home. Measuring relationships, how do you do that? And this, Dale and I usually talk about this freedom within a framework. And I'm glad you said that you could be part of both systems. You could be part of an informal and a formal structure and still cause change. And I think as well, ESG, from my perspective, similar to Joe's, I'm not quite sure how we plug into this thing. And it feels like they being the word, it's always trying to be a linear progression plan. It's something to tick a box. And, it's funny because you mentioned back again, it is starting with relationships. And then we all know that relationships are quite messy and they're quite complex and they're difficult to understand. There is emergent and novel issues when it comes to doing new things, especially when you're trying to do the right thing, which we think this is, right?
Yes.
Doing good stuff is a great platform to begin. And I would love to be involved in more of these types of conversations. So hopefully we can have another one. My question's coming, don't worry. So for me in the ESG space, how do we get to a position where we have a common understanding? Because one of the things I fundamentally get confused about is new language. And we use this term common language a lot. So we're trying to get to a point where we're speaking the same language as the people that we're trying to influence. And I find that these heroes, these people that are trying to do right things in the right places in these communities have that effect. They somehow can speak the local language. They understand the local concerns. They convey in a way that we could never really do. And I find that really fascinating. And I used to do this, going back to Jo's comparison from projects, where a role and title didn't necessarily mean they had the influence for change. Yeah. And I would call them people of interest. And I would find it was the executive assistant, or it was the project coordinator, or it was a project manager who really didn't have control, but they had the influence over the people in terms of understanding what needed to be doing, coalescing around a common vision, getting that inspiration and that motivation, which I thought was really lovely. How do we get to that common language for ESG, or are we still just in that kind of churning and understanding space?
I don't know. I mean, you know, that ESG space looks very different depending on where you're standing. So you know, if you are, funny enough, if I'm in Tanzania doing the work I do there, and I mention ESG, people look at you absolutely blankly. They have no idea what that term is. If you're in the social entrepreneurship community, such as I am, there's a lot of sort of discussion about sort of ESG investment and how to get your hands on it. My husband works in carbon offsetting and forestry, so he's coming at it very much from that angle. And when he's in the financial sector, there's a different lens. I suppose what does unite it all, what is that common language, is an aspiration to do the right thing. But I suppose there's also a slight difference in emphasis, because people would have said that charity also shared that characteristic. I think in the ESG space, there is an underlying assumption that maybe people don't necessarily acknowledge, that it's, oh, we can do the right thing within the broad framework of capitalism. So one of the things that I'm not seeing much in the ESG space, which is worrying, is the idea of transforming the system. And maybe that's why the trackers all look so unsatisfying to somebody like me, because there's no transformation inherent in that. It's just measuring activity within these broad parameters of the status quo.
Yeah, it's something of, you know, more of the same. And back to the relic of, we want to try and use the same tools, or same toolbox perhaps, and apply it to new and novel terms. And that's not, and I read a book once, it was what got you here won't get you there. And I think that's a really good phrase for saying, like, if we want to change, we can't use the systems of the old. We have to come up with new, novel and emergent approaches, maybe be innovative. And Jo and I were talking about that term and how that should be redefined, because I think it's kind of lost its meaning. And then talking to Dave Snowden a few episodes ago, we talked about people have forgotten the art of talking or making things simple again. I think because it's complex, we believe we have to have a complex answer. And what just happened to simplifying? And you've done a great job, by the way, on this whole podcast to keep things simple for us simple-minded people. But I do believe that conveys a stronger message.
I agree. I'm always saying the art is to make simplicity out of complexity. I mean, that is the art. And I suppose that the tool for that is the use of powerful questions. You know, you don't need, and this is a researcher's training, of course, you don't need an answer. Researchers never give answers to anything. They just learn what more questions need to be asked. And I think there's something in that you know, posture of genuine inquiry that we really lack in the project space. It's always a pursuit of answers and solutions, and not really an inquiry about why things are as they are.
Yeah, I think you're right there. This goes back to your data design and behavioral intelligence piece. And I think when I've been in meetings about projects, it always seems to be the lagging indicator. And for me, that was bothersome, because it was things that were out of my control or had already happened. And so how do we get to a point where we're looking at leading indicators and affecting change on the future of an outcome, rather than the past, which we'll get hit over the head with when it's not ideally within that system structure? How do you kind of gather your thoughts and articulate the best types of questions to affect the future?
So I'm very comfortable with uncertainty and sort of working emergently. And a lot of my clients really struggle with that, because they'll be saying, you know, no, we've got to define the indicators for the whole pathway to change. And I'm a little like, you know what, let's just define the destination and we'll see what the path takes us. And as long as we are listening deeply and making sense of what's emerging on that path, that's the indicators for that journey. And then let's just keep an eye on that destination. To what extent are we achieving it? To what extent are we needing to pivot? To what extent is the destination no longer relevant? You know, so for me, I'm quite comfortable, but I'm definitely very aware that comfort is not typical amongst others, because it's where I really get pushback with clients is no, we need a spreadsheet that's going to chart out in minute detail this journey.
Yeah, definitely, Jo.
Yeah, no, I've got this image of the mindful project manager. It'd be brilliant. I'd love it. You just sort of wander through this forest and sort of pay attention to what's going around you. And I think that's the bit that I'm quite interested in, is this idea that we're talking about the invisible. We're talking about the things that are often hidden under the surface. You're helping them bubble up by finding those people who kind of have influence in that space. Yeah. Given that you're such a good question asker, I've got this. There's some work being done at the moment by Jay McGonigal. She's brilliant. If you haven't heard of her, she's worth looking up. She works in the sort of gaming world, but gaming for good. So she's trying to take all the addictiveness of gaming technology and the ways that you do that type of thing and use it to push the world forward. And she's got something called Urgent Optimists at the moment. So she's part of the Institute for the Future. And she's looking
for that idea.
Exactly. It sounds exactly like what you're looking for, are these urgent optimists. Yes. But one of the games they play, so I want to test you here. One of the games they play is tell us something true about today. And then in 10 years' time, you say the exact opposite of that. And then you need to explain what might have happened. So just something that is fundamentally true about today in the space, in your space. And then we'll just play with why it'd be the complete opposite in 10 years' time.
Okay, so I'm going to scaffold off Christina Figueres, who is an absolute goddess. But something that is true today is that we are fucking the world, you know, pretty much.
Great one.
And something that is true in 10 years' time is that we will have fixed it. We will have fixed our own errors. And that is Christina, who says, we always overestimate what we can achieve in a year and underestimate what we can achieve in a decade. And I think that alongside everything that we're talking about, of course, timelines are so critical, aren't they? You know, they act as such a constraint on our thinking.
Indeed. So what's happened in the last 10 years, talking about this future where we're in this place where we've unfucked things, which would be quite nice. What's happened in that space between that 10 years? Like, what do you think is some fundamental levers?
That the technology now exists for us to completely sort of transform energy usage, transport, you know, these key drivers of climate change. So the technology exists. The damage is so palpable and so being experienced so much now that the urgency for change has kicked in. And Paris really was game-changing in bringing the connected actors together on a shared page. And so we have this window.
To make the change. We found all our urgent optimists, really.
Exactly, yes.
I want to just go back to you at the very beginning. You were talking about, like, you did a degree which is effectively looking at the healthy organization.
Yeah.
And so I want to continue on our path in our forest and have that as the sort of image of the organization. Yeah. What would that forest look like if it was a healthy organization?
So one, it would, for me, a networked organization is absolutely fundamental, and a move away from hierarchy. So, I mean, instead of looking at the forest from, you know, the roots through to the soil, through to the trunk, through to the roof of the tree, you'd look a macro view and you'd look at the forest. And you'd actually look at the relationships between the trees and how they speak to each other. And so it's the ties that are fundamental in a healthy organization, not the structures.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a key reframing of how we look at organizations, because if you look at the health of ties, you look at how we communicate, how we listen, how we make sense of stuff, you know, how all of our individual perspectives aggregate into something quite profound. If you look at structure, you're always just looking at, you know, well, what shape is the leaf, and, you know, how thick are the branches, and how tall is the tree, and, you know, they're characteristics that are sort of irrelevant to how the tree functions. And so I think it's a reframing. I hope I've carried your metaphor. I haven't destroyed actually the metaphor in overuse.
No, beautiful. You're saying how important the mycelium is, which I'm, you know,
yeah.
completely on board with.
You know, it's again, it's the invisible stuff, isn't it? You don't see the ties, but it's what feeds things. Whereas, you know, we are so preoccupied with the visible sort of indicators of status.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, Jo and I agree on this mycelium point very early on. And I think this element of looking top down and understanding the arrangement of information rather than the verticals. And I think we get stuck in these verticals. It's the way the structures, Western society in particular, is set up. We have vertical departments, we have vertical efforts and enterprise and initiatives, but we don't do a lot of cross collaboration. And I've worked in firms where they've tried that, where we had, you know, you might have heard this before, integrated product teams. And then they introduced, oh, that wasn't working. These integrated product teams, because you'd have engineers on their own, designers on their own, installers on their own. I said, what if we had cross-product teams? And I almost got excited about that, except they made that the same thing, but except we went across the organization. And it was the start of something interesting, because the idea was then that functional group, right? Who didn't just understand the tree, and I'm going to go to your analogy there, Jo and Kate, but also understand what that tree was connected to. And it was the information highway for that particular progression of linear. So we're all aiming, and we're all, I guess, on this train of time. It was the unmovable constraint, and it's a very difficult one to navigate. The other one is finance, but we'll get to that in a sec. And so the hard part was then understanding the flow and the nature of information, and how do we make meaning of that? And with projects, if you think about how projects, you went back to it before, you said, you know, they want everything planned out to the nth degree for a mega project that's going to take 10 years, and we have no idea about what's going to happen next year. We just have kind of key ideas of where we want to head. And there's no room for movement in that. And so we're still stuck with some of these relic ideas of how to get or transfer information from one place to the other. Then when we do make novel breakthroughs, or we do great things, we say, that was excellent. And we forget how to kind of trap, store, and retrieve that information. And so my question is really around that retrieve and understanding, because understanding what it's doing, as in information from left to right, is great. But how do we learn from each other? How do we then, again, back to the point of amplification, if we have a great project, or if we have a great community and we do great things, or at least individuals do, that we want to, I guess, amplify, we want to do more of the right things and less of the things that don't make sense. How do we do that? How do we store and retrieve? A bit like a battery, or a memory function, retrieve and recall. Is there something you've seen?
Well, I'm just wondering, I mean, it's like you say, it's elusive. It's a little bit like the Holy Grail, isn't it? But I wonder whether thinking of it in terms of retrieving information is necessarily helpful. You know, I mean, and I say that as somebody who works with data, but what makes something successful, it's not really the data, it's the dynamics, isn't it? It's I mean, I don't want to sound too woohoo, but it's the energy that emerges when people come together and they're collectively excited to be on a journey towards something. So if we're saying, well, how do we reenact that? I'm not sure necessarily that the data will tell us that much. You know, we did this, we did that, this happened. I wonder whether it's more the characteristics of the space and the interactions that one needs to be able to capture and reenact.
Is this like climate control rather than, you're setting the environment perhaps, or the ecology for these things to come together rather than defining what should be in that space?
Yeah. I
That's
mean,
interesting.
there's a huge amount of research on sort of the characteristics that sort of foster self-organization. And this is something, funny enough, you don't hear much in the project space, is the idea of self-organization or collective action. But really, that presumably is a precondition for building big stuff, in a different way.
I would love to hear a project do that, Jo, wouldn't you? Just, the idea of self-organization rather than, I guess it's more dictatorial. I mean, it's saying this is the structure we will abide by, and people are filtered into these roles and titles, which may not serve a purpose because the project is novel or emergent. And then you are stuck within this framework, which may not be self-serving.
I just think that actually it happens. It is happening. It's happening all the time. People just don't acknowledge it. And so therefore, by not acknowledging it, you accidentally put barriers in the way of it.
Yeah.
So then the formal structures get in the way of the self-organizing that's happening. I mean, you look at anything that's at that sort of mega scale of project. And I don't know, I mean, I work mainly on mega projects, but there's so much self-organizing going on. It's not funny because there's no way anyone top down knows all the things that need to happen. It's so specialized now in all its areas that they're very busy self-organizing. The problem is that they self-organize without any structure to connect. So they end up self-organizing over here and getting further and further away because it makes perfect sense for the problem that particular team's trying to solve. What they don't realize is that the team next door has exactly the tools they need. All they need to do is create a little bridge.
Yes.
And they could have, half their work could be gone. So
and hence the power of ties. Yeah. Because if that tie was there, you wouldn't have the siloed self-organization. You'd have the network.
Yeah.
And I think is technology enhancing that, Jo, do you think? And Kate, you think that's helping that tie in?
I don't know. Jo would have a lot more experience than me.
I think the way we're using technology at the moment, potentially not. But I think the sort of work that you do, Kate, with when you're talking about social network analytics and finding those key influences, those are your bridge builders.
Yes.
They're the people who create that link, because the reason why people go to them is because they happen to know what's happening on the next island and what's happening over in this space. And that's why they're influential, is because they can speak multiple languages. They're translators. So I think that's probably where the technology, if you use the right technology, and I mean, I'd be really interested in knowing a little bit more about like Connect Go and how you utilize that technology, like what you're putting it to use to in terms of.
So I'll give you a cool example of a piece that we're just doing at the moment. It resonates a bit with this idea of self-organization in silos. So there's a big global initiative to end the care of children in orphanages and to strengthen families so that children live with families. And at the same time, there's quite a market in orphanages, both in terms of sort of the evangelical church financing them, but also if in the East African setting of families thinking, I live with a degree of poverty, I want the best for my child. If I put them in an orphanage, they're going to access schooling that I would never have the ability to give them. So there's a market there. And then at the same time, there's sort of government, in inverted commas, commitment to end institutional care. And there's a whole sort of groundswell of small organizations that are countering orphanages by strengthening families, building a network of individuals who take in vulnerable children. And those little clusters of community-based work, never the twain shall meet. So they work completely independently of each other. And the government is completely ignorant of what they're doing. So you've got lots of self-organized action going on that is invisible. So similar to what you're describing. And so what we are doing at the moment is a piece of work with 5 Tanzanian agencies who are interested in the wider campaigning advocacy space on this, where we are working with them we've got our little mobile app, and we're looking at, their interests in change and who they go to when they come across a vulnerable child. So they'll take the app out into the communities where they work as social workers. And every time they interview a family or an orphanage owner or a social worker or a care leaver, they'll ask them these questions, who do you go to when you see a vulnerable child? And so from that, we'll then build the network of what is that mycelium of actors that are actually protecting kids that the formal system, whether it's formal social welfare or government or the non-governmental organizations, don't see. And it's those formal actors that the issue that you see with us is that they're gatekeepers to change. So they have an agenda that's completely disconnected from the lived realities of people who actually act when they see a vulnerable child. So what we're trying to do is to map all of those individuals. Yes, it will enable us to identify connectors, but it also, and I love this phrase, hands over the mic to people who are actually caring for kids. Because once they're on the system, we can survey them. So, what would prevent you from taking a child into your home? What was the experience of living in a care home? How has it affected your work? Are you willing to take a survey to assess your resilience so that we can start to understand the impact on young people's resilience of growing up in care? So suddenly you're making visible this network of thousands of people, and we can tap into their lived experience. You don't give people voice. Of course, people have their voices, but you can create the space for voice. And then we hope that we will be able to then act as rather than acting as gatekeepers, these agencies then become a bridge that can communicate people's lived experience to government. So we start to then have a governance effect that, these are the aggregated experiences of people on the ground. We can filter by demographic, we can filter by context, we can filter by type of care they received. And then you start to have an evidence-based conversation with government rather than an anecdotal and opinion-based conversation. And that's often the issue with our vertical versus our horizontal, is that people at the top of the trees are often getting an anecdotal view of the forest, not really an evidence-based view of the forest.
That's just so powerful, Kate. I'm really in my brain's taking it to one. I love the fact that it's mobile and you're utilizing people who are already out in the community.
Yeah.
So you're not creating a whole new infrastructure, you're not putting a whole new layer on anything. You're just basically giving a tool, using technology in a really powerful way.
Yeah.
My head's now immediately jumped to the issues within the construction industry around well-being.
Yes.
And I love this idea that because it's mobile, I love before you're talking about just like a Twitter version of 140 characters and providing. I could see for people on site at the front line, we've got a well-being crisis in the construction industry. That's shocking and quite worrying. I don't know. I mean, could you see this being able to be utilized in that type of space?
Yes,
just being able to hear those voices properly.
Yes, I could. I mean, one of the things that actually we're just applying to the EU for a big R&D grant is to build voice-enabled technologies into it. Because we work in areas of social deprivation and with people who are not often very literate and not digitally fluent, we're actually wanting to build in now voice-enabled technologies that people could call and tell their story. And then we could automate the analysis of that storytelling thing. Now, I think it could potentially take that idea of helplines further, because now I'm not sure how sort of practitioner appropriate this is, but a lot of the helplines take the therapeutic idea of I'm in need of help and I need a specialist to help me. Rather than a coaching modality would say everybody has agency to take decisions that are in their best interests. The role of a coach is to hold your hand in different ways without judgment, unconditional positive regard, to do that and accompany you on that journey. And I could see a role for the tech in a coaching sort of capacity, like you say, to address well-being, because you could network, for example, on a site you could easily use the network analysis. Who are the people who have a predisposition to coach? And then connect, even virtually, in a coaching conversation.
Yeah, this is fantastic. I mean, I agree with you, Jo. There is a bit of a concern around well-being, and particularly in construction. It's a hard job, and there are layers to that. And I think enabling technology to serve that better. And I love the coaching element as well. I think giving people agency again is a really powerful, empowering facet of what we do as coaches and team leaders. Right? We can't always see the horizon. We can't always understand what people are going through. But as these projects and these teams get bigger, it is harder to see. And, I've been on projects where you've had 200 to 3,000 people. So how anyone can understand what is really going on under the surface, is beyond me. And this application that you're talking about sounds, I guess, pliable, where it could be applicated in various other situations and provide support and informative views on the network, right?
So I think that one of the things that we struggle with from a design and delivery perspective is, so we've really sort of managed to nail how you would listen at scale and how you would aggregate the wisdom in that crowd knowledge. What we struggle with is, how do you close the feedback loop to the point that it feels dialogic? And that you're not just listening, extracting knowledge and making sense of that. The key design trick is, how do you close the feedback loop so that people can actually feel listened to, and that we haven't 100% got a solution to that yet.
That's actually an interesting point. I always wonder about that. The self, the interpretation that you have been listened to, how do you nail that? At scale too, right? It's because it's different for different people.
And it's that whole tension between, okay, you're trying to build something that people really feel seen and heard at an individual level, but then you're aggregating it into this crowd wisdom, but you still then need to hone back again to the individual. And that final bit is, so it's not so easy to say, oh, we took all your knowledge and we produced this data viz, and here's a link to the data viz. You've still got to be able to communicate something that feels that they were listened to and they have a stake, and that they were part of a change. And that's actually increasingly the bit I'm realizing is the key bottleneck. Yeah,
there's something about it being personable and feeling validated and valued.
Absolutely.
And contributing to something of importance.
Because the data landscape is increasingly extractive. If you think how much our preferences, our everything is being extracted from us in every interaction with tech. So you need to be able to counter that, to actually say, well, it's extracted and it's contributing to the collective good, but you need to be able to feed that back.
There must be some reluctance to that as well, I guess, this human mining, because, when government does it, it feels a pervasion of our privacy sometimes, particularly when COVID happened, we had a lot of this extraction happening with no feedback loop attached to it. You certainly don't want to make people feel ostracized or targeted in a way. You want it to be complementary. I'm sure it's different in different communities, but you're right. There is this kind of fickle piece of, how do we make that humanizing element to it without it just feeling like a technology pull?
Yes. Absolutely.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I got one more question on my side, and then perhaps I'll open for Jo for some final thoughts. But I had one around just this collation of qualitative storytelling and sense making. And I feel like, in the past, I've been part of things like unions, and for good reasons, where you felt like the people had a voice, and that connection then collated it up, and they were able to represent the people in terms of the real sense of things. And obviously that's kind of not happening anymore, at least where I work and the people that I work with. But this idea of pushing up to government in particular, I think, and representing not anecdotal evidence, but real evidence from real stories from real people is fantastic and phenomenal. Again, back to the amplification question, and this is the how, how do we get more of the same? How do we do this in different communities? I'm thinking of projects, but this could happen in any type of community.
So I think that as I mentioned earlier, there's a sort of epistemological challenge, that narrative is completely disrespected as a source of knowledge. Oh, it's just people's stories. you know, and I think there's a real need to counter that. So at the moment, we do all that analysis manually. You know, and I'm trained as a grounded theorist. So you're looking at those stories all the time and you're trying to identify what is the main concern of the participant here. And in this story, how are they resolving that concern? And that's how grounded theory works. So we do it all manually, which is beyond cumbersome. So again, part of what we're applying for an R&D grant to do is to say, can you automate that qualitative analysis? So there's certain automation of analysis that you can do, you know, with thematic analysis and sort of sentiment analysis. But the thing with the narrative for social change is you want to look at the causal analysis. So if somebody's main concern from this bit of text is why, where is the A and the B and the C? And how do they relate to each other? So that's really a design challenge or an engineering challenge, really, to figure out how to do that. And that's really what we're going to work on in the next 3 years, is building the capacity to do that.
That is fascinating. I've got one more question that just popped in my head while you were talking there, Kate. Yeah. And it was around, I guess, the influence of change, not just for myself, but, you know, I'm a father of 2, and I want to make sure that my kids are fostered, or at least empowered with these thoughts and these ideas, these techniques. And I'm very well aware of the school system and how old it is. Yeah. How can we inject this into schools in a way that it's adopted? Because, you know, like maths, English, and science, it's something that needs to be discussed. And I think there's something around responsibility and contribution. I think a lot of actually young people are far more in tune with the environment than we were in my generations. And I guess they want to, but how do they learn this? Is there a school program or something that perhaps you or something has been involved in?
Funnily enough, yes, my kids have just both left school recently, but they have what they call in their school the Institute of Social Impact. And they actually, the kids all go through social entrepreneurship training.
Wow. Yeah, that's fantastic.
I think it's pretty cool. So
that's very cool.
They really do look at learning about the difference between philanthropy and social enterprise, and learn about theories of change and social justice and decolonization. And I'm pretty wowed by, like you say, what they were doing within the school space. There does seem to be a bit of a movement towards pivoting what used to be the sort of charity inputs that schools would be making the kids do to this more sort of social change orientation. I mean, again, though, it's the paradox, isn't it? It's you know, they went to a privileged school where the space and the resources are there to do it, and it's valued. Why is it not being integrated more into the normal course of education? And you probably don't want to get me onto this, because I have a very strong bugbear that governments have an interest in the status quo and don't educate for transformation. But for a next episode.
No, definitely. Kate, we've got to have to have you back for round 2. I'm sure there is so much we can get to, but we are closing close to the end of the podcast. Jo, do you have any more questions for Kate?
I was just going to follow on from, because, you know, this is one of my favorite topics as well as the education side, but it was as much that there's a group called Rethinking Assessment. I'm a governor of a progressive school in North London, which is brilliant, and they are part of this thing called Rethinking Assessment, because so much of it is we're caught within a system. So it's the same issue that we've been speaking about all the way through, is it's quite hard to break out of that system, because the system then gets you into your A-levels, and then it gets you into your university, and then it gets you into your job, and everyone's kind of set themselves up for that, and they do their day job, and the day job's busy as it is. So, and we forget that there needs to be somebody who creates this change. Like, that can't be done by the actors within the system, because they're in the water that they swim in. Yeah. It's really hard to see it. So I suppose, I guess the thing that I'm hearing from your work is just how much that this is around making that visible.
Yes.
Letting them see that these things exist. Yeah. And I mean, one of the aims of the Rethinking Assessment is that they will drive this across all sorts of schools. So they start with the privileged schools, because they do have the capacity and space to test this out, and also have a certain gravitas that says, you know, if these sorts of schools are doing it, then obviously it's been done it's been done in conjunction with, I think, Oxford University and a few of the others, just to make sure that, there is a follow through. So it's tested. So I think it's really interesting, this idea of almost beta testing this, like where do you start? Like who do you start with? And I don't know where when you go into a situation, like where do you start from if you're looking to shake a system up?
Well, I always start from figuring out what the system is. And that always comes back to, as we said, people. I mean, a system is only made up of people. So you circle back to, if you don't know who the people are, it's all an abstract system. So how do you grapple with an abstract system?
And I think so much about it is, like, I was also thinking about what you were talking about before, which we'll probably have a long drink about this one, which is this idea of how do you get the feedback loop? How do you build that in? And I'm wondering, like, so much of what you're talking about is connecting things together.
Yeah. So
it's sort of creating all the relationships. So potentially that is what the feedback is creating a community for them to exist within that they didn't have before.
Potentially.
And I think it doesn't have to be about my individual needs and my individual, what I'm trying to do.
No. Yeah.
It's probably a relationship, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And what we've seen, certainly in the work we're doing in Shinyanga, is, yes, we use a lot of tech, but, I also consider face-to-face dialogue a technology. And it is, at the end of the day, in most settings, still in that face-to-face connection that the feedback happens and the community building happens. I think that the snazzy technology can supplement stuff, and it's good for information sharing, but it doesn't really do community building.
No, that's fantastic. Look, Jo, Kate, we are running to the end of the show. Before we go, we do have a quick pop quiz, Kate. Quick fire questions, just 5 about yourself. Are you ready to go?
Okay. I'm notoriously bad at quizzes. It's a bit of a family joke how bad I am at quizzes.
We'll see how you go. First one, steak, seafood, or salad?
Seafood.
Nice. What are the 3 must-have behaviors you look for in successful teams?
Listening, activating, heart.
Good. What is one piece of advice for people new to the project profession or the community?
Know your worth.
Very good. Number 4, if you could go back to one moment in your life, what would it be and why?
It would be when I got married to Jo. We got married in the bush in Tanzania, and I was very dyspeptic, because I am very dyspeptic, and dissed the whole wedding thing. I wasn't interested in it. I wasn't, why the hell are we doing this? And now, nearly 30 years down the line, I'm like, okay, I probably should have appreciated that more, because I do really love the marriage.
Great answer. Now, final one for you. Which superpower would you choose to have for one day and why?
Endless curiosity.
Lovely. Lovely, lovely. Love that all. Look, fantastic to have you here with us today, Kate. Appreciate everything you've talked to us about, and all your show notes, anything about your crusades, anything you're doing, we would love to share with our community. Please send them to us. Final thoughts from yourself, Kate, for our listeners?
Gosh, it's been so nice to be listened to. It really has. This has been a joyful way to start the day. Thank you so much.
No problem at all. No, it's been our pleasure to have you. And Jo, any final thoughts for you?
Oh, no, just thanks so much, Kate. I've really enjoyed this, and thanks, Val, for having me along on the ride.
No, and thanks for coming, Jo. Really, really brightened my day to see you.
That's lovely. We look forward to the second one, Kate and Jo. Thanks for being here. Well, that's all we have time for tonight. And if you like what you heard, you can pay it forward by sharing a link to this episode on your favorite social media. A massive thank you to Kate and my co-host, Jo. Thank you for listening. Until next time, we say stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. From me and Jo and Kate, of course, it's bye for now.